Good evening, everybody. We're just settling in, but I think we'll get started. Here. Bienvenidos, welcome. I call to order the Budget 101 study session of the Beaverton School Board, the Budget Committee, on March 11th, 2025 at 5:53 p.m. I'll now take attendance of the School Board Budget Committee members who are present. Zone 1, Susan Greenberg. Here. Jessica McBride. On her way. Okay, thank you. Zone 2, Dr. Karen Perez here, and Brian Bean. Here. Present. Zone 3, Melissa Potter. Here. And Jasmine Sears. Here. Welcome. Zone 4, Sunita Garg.
Here.
And Alok.
He was going
to join Zoom. I don't see him quite yet. Is there somebody? He didn't join yet. Not yet. Okay, thank you. Zone 5, Ugana. And she's online. Welcome, Ugana. And Reka. Yeah, I'm here. Oh, hi. Nice to see you. Welcome. Zone 6, Justice.
Here.
And Zone 6, Amy Webb.
Here.
Welcome. Zone 7, Tammy Carpenter.
Here.
And Lisa Schultz.
Here.
Our topic tonight, welcome everybody. It's great to see our new members and our returning members. Our topic tonight in budget is Budget 101 with the overview from the Associate Superintendent Mike Schofield and our budget manager Jessica Jones. So hand over to Mike.
Here you go. Here you go. You're good.
Nice to see the microphone's already dead for you.
I'm just going to quickly hand it over to Dr. Balderas to say hello.
I want to thank you for being here as we start the budget process for this fiscal year, and appreciate the volunteers that make up the budget committee. And I'll be brief because I know we have a lot to cover here, so I'll turn it over to Associate Superintendent Michael Schofield.
Okay, so welcome new folks. Appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about the budget. We consider this Budget 101 where we'll go over some of the high points of the budget. We probably won't get too weedy and meaty in terms of what we'll discuss today, but hopefully what you'll get from this session is kind of an outline of where we're headed, what things are looking like, where the funding pinch points are, and kind of how we put together the budget. So tonight we're going to talk about our background. We're going to talk about the components of the budget, funding sources and uses. We're going to talk about where the money comes from. We're going to talk about how we spend it, how we compare to others. We'll talk about budget process in terms of where we are in the process. This actually started back in November for us in terms of starting to crunch numbers. So we'll give you an update on process, and we'll give you an update on enrollment as well. We'll talk a lot about the general fund. That's our operating fund of the district. That's where most of our folks are staffed from. That's where most of our teachers are. It is the major funding source there is the state school fund, and included in the state school fund are our local property taxes. So we collect taxes locally, but they're included as a part of the state school fund. And we'll do our little scorecard that we do every year that says, here's what we told you when we met last time in terms of where we would end the year, and then how'd we do. We did a little better this year, so it'll be fun to look at that this year. We'll also talk about integrated guidance a little bit. We'll give you an update on federal funding, but I will give you the preview. The preview is going to be kind of shoulder shrugs about federal in terms of what's going on. We don't know a lot. We hear a lot, but we don't know a lot in terms of how it impacts our school district at this point. We'll go over budget listing and learning survey results. We're going to spend a little time on the staffing allocation methodology for folks that haven't seen it before. It's how we fund our schools, how we budget. When we create a budget, it's based on enrollment, and Jessica's going to go through that and share that with you. We'll do remaining timeline and any questions and comments, and we'll try to get out of here on time tonight. So components of the budget, obviously the big sources there, there's two significant sources. There you see the general fund budget in the blue, you see the capital projects fund in the green, and then you see a bunch of other smaller funding sources that we have in the district in terms of how we account for those and how we're required to account for those in the school district. But obviously our general operating budget is the big one. Capital projects is currently big. Not all districts have a capital projects fund. We're lucky enough in our community to have one. So you see, it's a large chunk of resource for 24-25. This next slide, the piece of the pie here is that state school funds at 87%. That's a very large number. Again, in Beaverton, we are fortunate to have a local option levy that helps. And again, not all districts get that. Some districts, it'll be 93, 94, 95% of their funding source will be just the state school fund. And then when you look at the other, think about things like earnings on investments, some money we get from our ESD, that's what's kind of out there in that other column. But again, the state school fund's the big piece, so that's what we keep our eye on, that's what we track closely. In terms of how we spend money, this is a pretty lopsided bar graph for you, but we spend money 89.2% on people. So where does most of our money go? We're heavily invested in people. We're in the people business. We're not making widgets or manufacturing, so we're heavily driven by staff and spend a lot of money there. We break it out there from purchase services, supply of materials, capital outlay, just some of those other areas. But again, this is to show you that we are a people-driven business. General fund FTE by type for 23-24, so we're giving you the actuals from the prior year. You can see a large percentage is licensed and school-based staff, more than almost 89% of our budget there. If you add to that school-based administration at 2.7%, we're up over 90%. So of the 90% we spend on staff, about 90% of those are out in school buildings. How we compare. So we do some comparisons just to let you know where we stand in Beaverton compared to some of our neighbors. No magic to the selection here. We've compared ourselves to some large districts, Portland Public and Salem-Keizer being two larger, just slightly larger than we are. Hillsborough, who is a close neighbor to us, and Tigard-Tualatin again, because they're a close neighbor to us. So nothing magic about these districts other than kind of geographical location as well as size of school district. And based on that, how we compare in ending fund balance, you can see fund balance where we are in Beaverton. We're in really, really good shape. You can see how we compare to Portland, next in line, Salem-Keizer, Hillsborough, and Tigard-Tualatin. So as you talk to neighbors and friends or read in the newspaper about large budget reductions that are announced in school districts, you haven't heard that from Beaverton because again, we've had large reserves and we've been able to avoid those large budget cuts. I think Portland Public's gone out publicly with around 40 million in reductions. I'm not sure where Salem, they were around 30, maybe somewhere in there. Anyway, you won't hear us talking about 40 and $50 million reductions this year as we go through the budget, again, because we've got reserves and we've begun to spend them down, but we'll show you how that looks a little later on. Expenditures. So how do we compare with how our neighbors spend money? That's an actual percent of operating spend per student by function in 2024. Again, Beaverton's highlighted in the red. And you see we look very similar to Salem-Keizer. We look very similar to Hillsborough, super similar to Tigard, all within a percent here or there on how we spend our money. Portland's a little bit of an outlier there in terms of how they account for staffing. And I'm not real sure why they're a little lower, but they traditionally have been. So again, I think the key takeaway from this slide is to say we look a lot like our neighbors look in terms of how we spend money. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, budget process update. What do we know? We'll start with what we know now. The governor's recommended budget is just under 11.4 billion. That's what she rolled out in December, and that's a pretty significant increase. It feels like a really large increase. But for us, it's not even quite a roll-up budget for us in Beaverton, and I'll get into the particulars of that in a minute. But basically, it's a very large increase, $1.2 billion over the next 2-year period. But we won't have a lot of new or innovative things going on without having to make choices about our budget. So this essentially represents kind of a status quo budget for most districts. Budget priorities, we've collected those from staff and community, and Jessica will talk a little bit about those tonight in terms of kind of the top 5 of what we've seen, and we'll also have a spot where you can look at all the comments we've received. We've got cost of living adjustments known. We've got that for our license group. We're currently in bargaining, just started this week with our classified association group. And so their contract is up at the end of June. And hopefully we'll get that put to rest so that we can get good budget numbers in our budget for next year. What are we working on? So this is the sausage part of it. Jessica and her team are working on applying the staffing allocation methodology formulas and grinding that through the process of showing how we allocate those resources to schools based on some final enrollment projections that we got last week. We're analyzing budget priorities that we've collected from the staff community and students. And we're considering budget reductions. We've kind of pinpointed a target of around $10 million for this year. We've got some of those in process now. Superintendent has begun to take a look at those. And so we're working on that still at this point. In terms of what we need to know, what we typically get after the March economic forecast, which we got just in late February, is we get some kind of a budget framework from the legislative co-chairs. So we'll hear something from the legislative side. Again, the governor's recommended budget is great, but the governor doesn't pass the budget. It's the legislative branch that does that. So we'll look to the legislature now that last forecast is out. Sometime this month, usually, it used to always kind of be the first week of March, but last week it was mid to late March. I don't think we had it last year even, or last biennium when we met. So in the next few weeks, look for that, see what they're talking about in terms of the state school fund and what they might be putting forward. As I mentioned, classified negotiations, we've started those. And the May economic forecast is going to be the key. That May economic forecast is what the legislature is required to use to build their two-year budget. So there'll be much anticipation and there'll be a lot of talk, and then the activity really heats up after that forecast comes out, because that's, again, what the legislature is bound to build the budget based on, is that forecast that they get in May. The last couple of forecasts have been positive. New state economist, a lot of change going on at the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis. Looking at tweaks to the methodology, so that's actually brought more resources into the state budget. I think it was a little over a $2 billion increase in December, and maybe $300 million and more resources just in February with their most recent forecast. So a little more resource under the new methodology. We'll see how that plays out in May. But that's a key date for us. And again, our budget will be pretty much settled by then. So for those of you that don't know, we're going to take our best guess at what we think the state's going to come in at for the state school fund. We'll bring it to you. We'll propose a budget. We'll ask you to approve a budget. The board will get it in June. They'll be asked to adopt a budget because they have to have a budget adopted by June 30th. And then in July or sometime, we'll hear what we actually got funded at, and we'll monitor and adjust as we need to. District enrollment, here's the last several years. Down a couple thousand students, down a little bit this year. We're running into that kind of 400 to 700 student drop range right now. Pretty predictable the last couple of years. That is primarily based on what's going on with us demographically. So we have smaller kindergarten classes coming in, larger 12th grade classes leaving. So birth rates are lower in Washington County now. That's what we base our kindergarten numbers on. They've been pretty good in terms of reliability. But again, we just have smaller kindergarten classes coming in, larger 12th grade classes leaving. And that's going to work its way through the system based on a forecast for the next 10 years. We'll see that coming. Not unique to Beaverton, not unique to Oregon, not unique to the United States. A lot of districts seeing enrollment declines caused by low birth rates. Okay, this is a really busy one, so let's take a few minutes and look at it. The black line that you see weaving its way through this chart is our enrollment over the last several years. The multicolored bars that you see represent staffing and areas of staffing that we have funded. So when you look at the green, you think classroom teachers, and you can kind of see within the legend there how we look and how we've looked from year to year. And one of the key takeaways on this slide, when you look at it, is while our enrollment has declined the last several years, our staffing has not. In fact, it's gone up for the last few years. That won't be sustainable over time, right? Like, we can't continue to grow staff while we have declining enrollment. That's the basis of our funding. The basis of our funding is our students and the demographics of those students. But that kind of gives you a glimpse of kind of how we've kind of morphed over the last several years in terms of staffing. Questions or thoughts about that? We can get you some more background on it. Jessica, go ahead.
Could you use the microphone, Jessica? You can turn it on right there. No, it's okay. That way they can hear you online too.
Just turned it off. Sorry, my bad. So the governor's recommended budget of 11.4 billion, is that going to fund BSD at current service level, or would that represent a decrease?
It's close, except that we have been spending more than we're bringing in already. So we're already operating at a deficit.
Gotcha.
If it weren't for that, it'd be in the ballpark, I would say. Does that help?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, thanks. Okay,
I think we have one more question.
Sure, happy.
Jasmine?
Regarding the decline in enrollment, are we seeing that same decline in private schools, or are some of these students actually just going to private schools instead of public schools?
I know that right during COVID, I believe there was a shift in terms of number of private school students. I don't have that for us for this year. What I would say is settled out in our district is that purely that birth rate demographic change that's happened. We're pretty good on the number of students that are moving in or moving out during the year.
It's really down at the elementary level. At the K-1-2s, there's just less folks having kids. So you're going to see that. When you look at our high school numbers, they're pretty stable or upper, but it's the K-1-2s, so people are having less kids. And that's a national phenomenon.
So there was a time where I felt like there was a structural shift of people that moved out of state and moved to different places and did different things. And that happened right during that COVID time. But since then, it's really settled down, and it's really just purely fewer kindergarten students coming in, bigger classes leaving. Does that help? Okay, thanks. Okay, so you can look at these more at your leisure, but that's kind of what's going on with enrollment and staffing to give you a picture. State school fund history, here's where the projections have gone over time. You can see those years where, on average, it's gone up in that 9 to 10% range. The year that's still giving us the fits is 21-23, when it only grew 3.3%. Imagine us trying to pay for 2 years of services with cost of living increases and other things when we got 3.3% over 2 years. So you can kind of cut that number in half for simplicity's sake and say, we're getting 1.75 increase when we're paying 3 and 4% COLAs. So that's something that got us in a little bit of trouble. It's kept up a little better since then. But those are things to look out for, and that just gives you a little bit of a history of what's gone on with the state school fund. When you hear things like unprecedented funding that you hear sometimes, that's because you can be unprecedented with $1 more, right? So we talk about unprecedented funding from year to year, and it's happened every year, but it hasn't necessarily kept up with inflation. Okay, here's a weedy one. We'll spend a little bit of time on this. For those of you that are the veterans on the board and budget committee that have seen this before, this is a kind of a layout we give all the time. And when we look at numbers, we look at it in this way. So I'll take some time here. On the left-hand side, the left column, you see resources, where you see beginning fund balance, state-controlled, locally controlled. Those are our revenue sources. Our beginning fund balance is our resource that we ended the prior year with. So you see that $138 million in that first box on the spring projection. State-controlled for us, that's the state school fund and property taxes that are collected through the state school fund. And then locally controlled for us is our local option levy, and I think, as I mentioned before, some ESD money we get, some interest earnings, some fees that we charge and collect. And that's the resource side. Down below that is the expenditure side. Salaries, $303 million. You can see benefits at $180 million. And then we just say all other. Again, going back to the slides we had up before, you saw where we said we spend 90% on people. You can see how that plays out in our salary and benefit lines, and then we show the all other below that. And then we show our ending fund balance based on the total resources above that 705 minus the 544 gave us a projected ending fund balance last spring of 160 million. And then we have a long-term planning reserve that the board put in place several years ago that we still haven't quite filled the bucket on yet, but we're getting closer to a 5% reserve there. You can see the balance of that. So overall, what we projected is we'd end the year with about $160 million in ending fund balance in the general fund and $23 million in the long-term planning fund. How did that actually work out? What we actually finalized at, if you look at the total resources, we thought we'd be at 705,146. We ended up at 708,493, a little bit better by 0.5%. So we missed on resources by 0.5% from our projection. And then you look at salaries, benefits, and everything else. We got much closer on salaries, very close on salaries. Benefits a little off, but overall on the expenditure side, we were off by 0.1%. So pretty happy with our forecasting accuracy with the numbers we gave you last spring and how we ended up. Make sense?
Question,
Now,
one question.
Sure.
What was the local option levy? I guess that was the locally controlled.
It's in the
Why was it-
locally controlled.
Why was that down?
I'll tell you, the primary reason that locally controlled went down was we had, what was the issue there? I think we had it was something that went on between what we had in state controlled and locally controlled where we had it flip-flopped. So not a big deal, but it was, we caught that. Okay, now we'll go to an even worse slide that you'll have to look at and spend time on, and we'll get you these electronically so you can access them as well. But on this next slide, this is the numbers and kind of our projection and our forecast that we have as of today. And we'll update this for you as we get into May when we come back with the actual proposed budget. But this is our most recent and best shot at it. And I want to go over the assumptions so that you know that as in terms of how we built these numbers. But it's based on state school fund updates for not only on any given year we're working on last year, the current year, and next year with the state school fund. So the state school fund for last year will not close out until this coming May. And that's because the state collects all the information from all the school districts and does all their review of those numbers and puts them into again, that big sausage grinder, and it comes out and it says, here's what your state school fund actually should have been last year, and then they'll give us an adjustment. We get an adjustment every May, and that can be up or down, depending on, did we collect more property taxes than we thought? Did we collect less property taxes than we thought? That adjustment happens. So we're looking at last year, 23-24 currently, 24-25, the year we're in, we're paying attention to that in terms of where the state school fund is, and now we're starting to look at the next biennium, 25-27. So you can see we're using the most recent state school fund updates for those. We've got the state school fund at $10.2 billion for 23-25, which was what was legislatively adopted, so we have that. $11.4 billion for 25-27, and we bumped it to $12.5 billion when we get out to that 27-28 year. So assuming about a 9.9% increase or 9.6% increase that year as well. It includes PERS rate increases. We've got PERS rate increases that are included in here for this upcoming biennium. It doesn't include changes that are under review for 25-26. So we're talking about budget reductions. We haven't made any yet, right? Like this is just the roll it up and roll the ball out like we did last year with some adjustments for enrollment. It doesn't include the Student Investment Act. We'll talk a little bit about that, high school success or ESSER funds. And again, as we always say at the end, it's based on the best information we have at this time. That's my way out of this to say, you know, as soon as I present numbers, I know what's the one thing I know? They're wrong, right? Like we're out here forecasting several years in advance. And what I'm trying to say or share is what's the picture and are we in the ballpark here? So again, in the same format you saw on the previous slide, you can see what we're estimating for currently in 24-25. We think we'll end the year with a deficit of a little over $15 million. We budgeted for those of you that remember or have it on your bingo card, we budgeted for a $17 million deficit. last year, so that's trimmed down to 15 at this point. And that's where we end up, where we think we'll end up the end of this year currently. If you look into 25, 26, that number grows. We get up into almost a $29 million deficit. And then if we just keep doing the same things we've been doing, that goes up to a $52 million deficit the year after that. And if we just kept going the way where we'd be at a $61 million deficit in that final year in 27, 28. Now, we won't do that, right? Like, that seems like growing deficits that large isn't something that's sustainable over time. We do have large reserves, and even with that, we would end that 27, 28 year with roughly a total of $62 million in reserve, some in the long-term planning, and almost nothing in the general fund reserve. So possible, yes, but what this committee and board would be faced with that following year is at least, what, a $70 million reduction that you'd have to make in 1 year? So what we tend to look at, and what we want you to look at, is that $15 million deficit. What can we do to keep a deficit within a range that makes sense for us while we have large reserves? So we wouldn't say, let's cut the whole $29 million and eliminate the deficit, because our reserves are fairly significant. So let's spend down some of those reserves. And that's what the superintendent and his cabinet is dealing with now, is how do we manage reductions, and knowing that over time we can't keep using these one-time resources of fund balance. How do we balance that with future funding and not running ourselves off a cliff in a couple of years? So what you'll see when we come back in May is a more balanced approach in terms of what we think and where we think those deficits are, and what the superintendent's best shot at recommendation for the next year's budget will be. That could come from new resource and new revenue. If it looks like funding might get a little better, it could also come from sharper numbers and a combination as well of any budget reductions we might need to make. We'll likely have some budget adds too, right? We don't have a year where we look exactly like the year before. So if we have some of those, we'll bring those to you as well in terms of any budget adds or reductions. Does that make sense? So for those of you that this isn't talking to, if you flip to the next page, we'll look at it just in terms of a line graph and what that looks like. So you can see the blue line is our revenue, the red line is our expenditures. It's been under for several years. So that's how our ending fund balance and our reserve has grown over time. You can see the crossover that's happening right now this year. And you can see we're planning to spend a little more than we bring in this year. And if we don't do anything, that gap just continues to grow. Over time. When I present this to our school principals, I always tell them that blue and red line need to be friends. We want to keep them close so that we're not operating either at a surplus or a deficit too much. We want to keep those numbers kind of close together. So for those of you that would rather see it kind of in a visual way, this is the same information we presented on the prior page in a more visual format. All right, I think I'm done talking for a little bit. Jessica.
Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the integrated guidance. Where's my clicker? There we are. So the integrated guidance requires a new plan for each biennium. And so Dr. Cordy and her team have been hard at work on that. The integrated guidance includes 6 grants. The biggest ones for us are the student investment account and the high school success grant. So that's where I'm going to focus, and I'm going to look at all of this from a budgetary lens. And additional information about the upcoming plan will be shared later in tonight's board meeting. So I'm going to walk you through this one. This is a comparison between our total award amounts for the current school year and what our estimates are for the upcoming school year. So the graph on the left is our current year, and the graph on the right is the estimates that we have received so far for the upcoming school year. Each one of the colors of the pie are one of those 6 grants that are included. And what you'll notice here is that they look very similar proportionally. What I want you to look at is at the very bottom of that, and you will see that the total award for the current school year compared to the total award estimates for next year has only increased 0.91%. And as we've talked about many times already tonight, we are primarily staff. And so when our awards are increasing 0.91% and our agreements and our step increases are growing at a much faster rate than that, it's hard to keep up with that. So what you will see is very similar things in our plans, but there will be some adjustments to balance those budgets. But the important thing that I want you to remember right now is that Dr. Cordy and her team have to do this and meet the ODE deadlines to get this plan in, but we are not finished with our budget yet. We are still working through that. So some of the changes you might see, it doesn't mean that we're done with the overall budget. So I'm going to start with the student investment account. This estimated award for us is $38.3 million. This is actually less than we have for this current school year. Not by much, but it did not grow. It actually went down. And so when you're looking at the FTE list that is inside our student investment account, what you'll notice is those look very, very similar, but the total is about 20 FTE less, and that is a combination of moving things around to other funding sources, and we're still trying to finish the rest of the budget. But the one really important thing is on this is that there is still over 250 additional staff funded by the student investment account that is directly in our schools. And the second big piece of the integrated guidance is our high school success grant, and our current estimate is $12.1 million for next school year. This is a small increase, and the total FTE in this grant is very similar as it is right now. So here is the federal funding slide that Mike mentioned earlier, and he kind of stole my thunder here. We don't know a lot. I had hoped to know a little bit more when we had put this slide up here and said, we're going to fill this out and we will have more information by then, and we just don't. So as I'm sure you know, there are a lot of discussions going on around federal funding and a lot of uncertainty, and we just don't have anything concrete to share at this time. What I did want to share was what the federal funding looks like for the Beaverton School District. So in the current school year, we have $32.8 million in federal funds that are allocated to us. And what you'll see in that pie chart there is that the largest portions are our school breakfast and lunch programs, and that is the green piece, and the dark blue is all of our title grants. This is all the Title 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 6, all of the title grants are included in that. We have our IDEA grant, and then you can see that light blue is a very small portion. Those are other federal grants. So, and in addition to this $32.8 million, we also have $26.2 million in carryover federal funds. So our grants, many of them qualify for a carryover, and so we can have an additional year to spend those funds. Out of that $26 million, 19.7 of that is an EPA grant for electric school buses, which we are watching very, very closely right now.
Jessica, just to clarify for some of our new budget committee members, like IDEA is our special education funding. So that's the IDEA. And then the title programs are programs that, do you want to share a little bit about just overall what title is?
So there are several title grants, and like our Title 6 is Indian Ed, Title 2 is for teacher professional development, Title 1 is for our lower income schools, which are, I think we have 14 or 15 elementary schools that supports. And there's Title 1C that supports our multilingual department and the students that they serve, as well as Title III, which is for migrant and immigrant students.
Yeah, thank you. No, it wasn't a test, but I just thought it's helpful.
I know,
for
I'm going
people.
through it all.
I can't remember all of them myself sometimes. Too. Good job.
Yes, and thank
A+.
you. We do love our acronyms. Okay, so now we're going to move on to our budget listening and learning feedback. So we released our budget listening and learning video on January 31st. It was open until February 28th, so approximately 1 month. And we received 1,729 survey responses. So this is down from last year. Last year was about 2,400 responses. 2 years ago was 1,500, so we're up a little bit from that. So we feel like this is a pretty good turnout. What I've organized here on this slide is the top 5 priorities for maintaining, and then the top 5 budget reduction suggestions. And then on the blue graph, those were kind of an open-ended question and any additional comments that were provided to us. And so we summarized that for you. And then there's that link there, and all 1,729 comments are there for your viewing pleasure. Okay, so now we're going to get into the staff and allocation methodology, which we also call SAM. You will get these slides a little bit later, so that is a live link to the current SAM document that we used for the 2024-25 budget, so this current school year. And what is important to know about this is that this is a budget model. We use it in the spring to allocate our budget based on what we know, the final enrollment information, the demographics that we're using and that we have in our schools right now, in other budget information. And when the students start to come in the fall, we use the SAM model to guide any decisions that are made to address large class sizes and other needs in our buildings. But this is really a one-time, we do this in the spring, and then we just use it as a guiding post. Our SAM model was updated in 2019, and we've made some small adjustments since then. In 2019, the Student Success Act was passed in the legislature, and that included the student investment account. So we use that as an opportunity to redesign our SAM model. And one of the really important things to us is that students that are experiencing poverty, they need additional supports, and all of our schools serve students living in poverty. And so the model that was there before was if you were over a certain percentage, you got extra resources, and if you weren't, you didn't. And the reality is that all of our schools need some extra support. So actually, with that, we developed a weighted enrollment model, and so we use those poverty percentages to give additional weights to our schools. Sunita?
Yeah, I just have a quick question. This is a clarification question. One, do you think the SAM model is working for our district? Because we see big class sizes and then small class sizes, but not much difference in the. What was the purpose? Was it the purpose was to improve the student outcomes, or was it to give supports to the teachers, or because when it's kind of lopsided, so how do you adjust during the year when you see a class that is oversized, where there may not be poverty?
So those are a couple different questions. So the first one is, when the SAM was built, it was built with the idea of recognizing poverty in our schools and that those students needed more supports. And so what our system does is we add weights to the system. They're kind of, they're phantom students in our system. So as you look at what Jessica's going to show you in a minute in terms of allocations, you'll see where we've got a allocation that we've made where we based it on, let's say, 24 students per teacher. But those schools that have higher poverty have more students in the system to help with that weighting, and gives them more resources at those schools of higher poverty. So that was intentional. That was probably the most intentional part of this, was realizing that where our schools struggle the most, we're at our schools that experience poverty, and how do we get more resource in a spread out way across 54 schools, right? in a way that made the most sense. And so, yes, that part was definitely intentional. In terms of what do we do when there are large class sizes, we use the SAM once a year. We use it for budget. That is the baseline, right? We have an enrollment forecast. It's forecasted out by school. We have poverty rates that we apply in percentages, and then we use that to build the budget. And we'll tell principals and schools in another month or so, based on enrollment and the demographics of your students, here's your staffing that the SAM has given. In the fall, in the summer, when we hear about large class sizes, we meet as a small group. There's a very small group that meets, probably 6 or 7 of us, that start meeting at the first week of August and start saying, all right, where do we have some class size problems? Because like I said, with my numbers, we're never perfect, right? So we start looking at class size adjustments that we might make. And those can change from year to year. If we had an enrollment forecast where we were down significantly from that forecast and it didn't look good and we were going to be struggling, we might be a little tighter with how we deal with some of those class size issues that we experience in the fall. In another year, like this year we were less bad on our projection, right? Like we didn't lose as many kids as we thought, and I think we added over 20 teachers at the start of school year. So once SAM happens, that's primarily for budget purposes. Then we start looking at, okay, what are the individual adjustments that need at a particular school, whether it's in area of special education, whether it's in classroom adjustments, those kinds of things. So that's when we'll look at those.
So also just the building principals staff their schools. So the building principals have the autonomy to be able to do that themselves. They typically work with the executive directors on that. And there's a difference also between elementary and secondary. At the elementary level, kids don't come in perfect 25 bundles of 25 or 50. So they come in a variety of different class sizes. So we have to add either a half-time or full-time person to the elementary to offset any classroom adjustments for size. At the secondary, we can add at 0.2 intervals, so 0.2 staff, because it's more of a period coverage type of scenario. And we could absolutely meet with folks if there's more discussion that people want, because it gets pretty complicated really, really fast when you're talking about FTE, which is our teachers, in terms of how people actually implement the staffing.
Right, and we don't have, so what you could see, Sunita, is overall a class size ratio of 23-1 in a school. But you might have a class that has 30 and a couple that have 19.
I saw in Tumwater and Stoller, their class median size is 34. So I'm sure they have bigger class sizes than 34.
Well, we should talk about that, because we should talk about what core classes look like versus other classes. I mean, we can talk some more about that.
Another question, follow-up question on that. How do you get the input whether a school has, because it's a big district. So if a school is struggling with big class sizes, how do you get input? Just from the principal, or do parents give you the input? How do you get it?
So we run numbers almost every day during the fall. So that's where the SAM, the team meets to discuss any staffing, and it's a group of administrators, including Dr. Cordy and her staff, to be able to do additional allocations. It started in August. So the principal weighs in, but also we just look at numbers. Like, where are you at? And are you under or are you over? That's where some systems, you either pull staff from schools or you add staff from schools. So to try and make a, if you're down 100 kids at a high school, you're going to lose a staff member. And maybe that staff member goes to a school, another high school possibly, where there's a need. And that's typical for every school district I've worked in or across the U.S.
It might be
Thank
good
you.
to, I don't know if people are interested, they could have a little session like you did, I think, last year with the SAM model. So
Yeah.
we came in groups of 2s
Yeah,
or
we-
3s. and
certainly.
People can ask questions too, because important.
Okay. I'm going to catch my slides up. Okay. So going back to how we developed our model that we are currently using, we had a team that worked on this for several months, and it included representation from every level of schools that we have, elementary, middle, high. We had options in there. We had, we also had team members from HR, business, IT, and we had a lot of input from our teaching and learning team to help us guide through this. So we worked on this for several months. At that same time, we were doing our initial student investment account feedback this was the very first year of that. And so we had all of the feedback and the priorities from our students and staff and community members around our student investment account. We were able to use that input as well. And then we also reviewed staffing models from other districts around the country, some that are our size, some that are larger, and did some review on how they allocate their staffing. So, as I mentioned, we came up with this weighted enrollment idea, and so our elementary schools are weighted at an additional 1.25, and our high schools are at 1.5. The reason that the elementary is a little bit lower is because that the elementary schools in our district who have high poverty numbers are also Title I eligible, and so they have Title I funds that can also support their buildings. The calculation is probably more complicated than you want to know right now, but I have an example. I'm happy to walk you through it, but I have an example of an elementary school that has 500 students and a poverty percentage of 25. So after we do the math, at a 1.25 weight, we would actually allocate resources to this school on 531 students. And even though we're only expecting to see 500, we would allocate resources on 531 students. So those are those extra students that we don't actually expect to see come into our buildings. And so at an elementary school, that's a whole extra teacher. And so that's kind of how our model works. And I'm happy to walk you through it, probably not right now, but I definitely have that available. So we have 4 allocations that are based on our weighted enrollment. So we have our classroom teachers, we allocate counselors, assistant principals at our secondary level, and non-salary dollars to our buildings based on weighted enrollment. As we mentioned, if we need any revisions to our model, we have our small SAM group. So an example of this is that we need to make an adjustment to the Flex Online School, which we did as we were opening up that school coming out of the pandemic. And then if we wanted to make a bigger change, like changing those poverty weighting numbers, we would pull together our big SAM group, which includes building and union representation. So included in SAM is most of our general education allocations, and in the 24-25 year, we were able to add our special education and our multilingual department allocations as well. And it's really, really complicated. I'm happy to walk you through it, but we have lots of layering. We have our general fund, and then we are fortunate enough to have our local option levy. And then on top of that, we have our student investment account. And then on top of that, we have our high school success. So we do a lot of layering here. It is a complicated calculation, but the most important thing with our SAM is we are continually improving this model. It is not perfect, and we are taking the feedback from our buildings on things that are or aren't working for them and reviewing those in our SAM team. So it's probably pretty small. I just wanted to give you an example of what this looks like. This is an elementary school. This is actually what SAM looks like. And so on the left-hand side, it is your principal, assistant principal, management support, and how they get that. There's criteria, and it'll tell them exactly how they're allocated that. At the bottom of that, it will say what students are included there. So this includes all of their specialized programs, special education students, as well as their pre-K students at the elementary. On the right side of that, it has a little bit of that front office support. And then if you look below that, that's our classroom teachers. So it says on there that it is calculated based on weighted enrollment. So it identifies which one of these allocations includes our weighted enrollments and which ones don't. And so when we're looking at this, if you look at our grades 3 through 5 ratio at that 26.75, and when I looked at the last classroom teacher report that we submit to the school board every month, our average in elementary was 23.5. So this is where that weighted enrollment comes in, where we're allocating we're allocating staff based on those weighted students. This is our middle school example. I didn't put teachers on here. I wanted to show you a little bit of what else is in this. We have counselors, which are included in weighted enrollment. If you go down at the bottom, we have our classified support, which also has criteria on different bands of number of students, but it's not weighted enrollment. And then there are also allocations that we just allocate. So every one of our middle schools has an academic coach, for example. And yes.
Microphone.
Jessica. New. I'm Susan. No, so every middle school has at least one, or like Stiller would have more than one academic.
So, no, our current is everybody gets one. The additional allocations come to those middle schools experiencing higher poverty rates. Okay. And then the last one I have here is an example of a high school, and so it also shows you the counselors, the additional supports that are in those buildings, and how those are allocated. Okay, I'm going to move on from Sam for a minute. We'll go through our timeline, what's left of it. Here, we're doing our Budget 101 right now. My team is busy applying those SAM formulas to the final enrollment that we received last week and trying to get all of that together so that we can share that with our teaching and learning team, HR, and our principals. We are still looking at the survey results, and as mentioned earlier, we are still looking at possible budget reductions. In May, we'll come back and we will propose the budget, and there will also be a second meeting for the approval of the proposed budget, and then finally in June, the school board will adopt the, did I lose it? As required by June 30th. So. And that is
Okay.
it.
Yeah, that's it for us for tonight. I know we rushed you through it.
Susan?
So my question would be, and it's a what-if question, so I'm so sorry for doing this.
Oh, good.
Because, because we have no control over what happens with the federal government, but discussions with this at the state level, if Title I is cut, or all titles are cut, or partial titles are cut, has there been talk at the state level to offset some of those cuts in our state?
No. Just no. So, and I know that's, right now we're looking at the unknowns, but we're looking at possible reductions in Title I. I'm hearing, 15%, possibly even 25% cut Title I. I'm seeing minimal, I'm hearing about minimal cuts for the feds in terms of, in looking at more of insurance or block grants to states. And we can talk a little bit more about that as we go through the block grants we've done before, and it flow through money to states and states reallocate. I know that we've all seen maybe the news in terms of the department being shut down a little bit or made smaller, but in different departments would go to different agencies across the government. So, or possibly assurances where we would have to, as states, we would have to agree to do certain things to receive the money. And that's something that we would take charge, that we'd wait for the governor, who is our state superintendent here in Oregon, to be able to provide some direction.
So I just want to clarify this for my own brain, Gus, sorry. That what you're saying is the what ifs, and who knows, we all question that. There's no contingency planning going on at the state. And should there be a superintendent asking for that? Or is OSBA asking for that?
The superintendents are at different places with their budgets and what they're projecting out in terms of title reductions in the future. I'd be hesitant to do anything until I hear certainty that something's going to happen.
Other questions?
Happy to take questions. I'll also be emailing each of you tomorrow to say, here's how you get a hold of this slide deck that you can look at, and here are the comments, and then you'll have Jessica and I, we are very always open and interested in sharing anything and all things budget. So if you want to schedule time with us, we are more than happy to meet. So happy to help you in any way you can. Take a look at the data and information, and if you need us, that'll be the way to reach out. So back to you, Chair.
Jessica?
I have two questions. The first one is, can you talk a little bit more about how you analyze the community survey results and how that might determine like your priorities?
We typically use that as kind of a filter. We set out, as we look for additions or potential budget reductions, we kind of lay out our equity lens and also some summarized information about the feedback we've been given. We also share with our executive team each of the comments, so everybody's got them, and they can review them. And then as we meet, as Gus calls us in to meet to talk about, you know, where we're going to end up on budget, some of those hard decisions, the expectation is we've reviewed those.
Thank you.
Ugana has her hand up. Oh, did you have a second
I
question?
do have a second
Sorry.
question. So there's been a lot of talk about like the state school fund and the governor's recommended budget. I'm wondering if BSD is active in conversations in Salem with legislators. Are there folks from BSD asking legislators, is there an amount that we should be asking legislators for? Just questions about.
So they typically don't like to hear from me because I'm staff. But I know our board is active, and they're probably the best ones to answer that they're engaged with our legislators, both our local and as well as some of the statewide folks that serve statewide. They're out talking to those folks.
So
I know
we
that for
formed
sure.
a committee, Jessica and team, this last year, and I maybe let Melissa speak to it a little bit. She's been kind of leading it with a couple other board members to ensure that our voice in Beaverton gets heard.
And it was one of our board goals was to increase and build the relationships between our local electeds and our board. And so in that effort, we voted on a set of legislative priorities. So for us, it was, and we came together, it was really the first time that I'm aware of where the Washington region, so Forest Grove, Banks, Sherwood, Tiger Tualatin, we all came together and shared the same two priorities with our local electeds. And that was the current service level, which you mentioned, which is so important. It's super geeky. It's never going to make the front page, but it's super important to our kids. And so just using our voices to elevate that conversation. And then also the need for special education funding. So those were our two priorities of if we all push together, that would make a really significant impact on behalf of our kids. And then as things are coming up, we go to town halls and we listen, but voice-wise, in the spaces that I'm in, those are the two priorities I share as a school board member.
And we
Thank
might be
you.
able to share our document. Maybe Carrie can send it out so that you can see what our priorities were, including high-cost disabilities, because we only get a certain percentage of that money back, and we only get, we have a cap of 11% for special education services, when many districts have more than 11% students. So that comes out of our other budgets to ensure that our students get the supports they need. So that would be a good document to share. And we also had wanted to ensure that our legislators kind of knew what our buildings were like, and so we invited them to have lunch at our school. We had several dates where multiple board members could go and speak with them, but also have time for them to walk around our schools and see what it was, experience, and ask questions too.
For a question for Chair Perez. So the cap for special education, is there any discussion on that cap being lifted or increasing? Or,
Yeah, we're getting some movement at the state level, and we also, with Dr. Balderas, I actually got to go to Salem. I got to go to Washington DC to advocate at the national level too, because of the we were promised 40% for 40% for a high cost. Is that correct? 40. Say that again. For IDA funding, get full funding for IDA, and we weren't getting that either. But we are getting movement at the state level on those pieces, so that's exciting to see. Tammy?
Just to follow up on this great question, Lisa, there is a hearing on the 13th, so 2 days from now in the afternoon in Salem, if people did want to testify about the SPED caps being changed, lifted, or submit written testimony. Lots of ways to find out how to do that. Thanks.
There's a website called OLIS. If you put OLIS into the search bar, and then you can, it'll help you find when those, and you can actually submit testimony through OLIS. So that's good too, if you can't make it in person. It's a great question. And we're organizing. It's very important. Ugana had her hand up. Ugana, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Mike, for your presentation. I'm almost certain that you have answered this question in the past, but I want to ask it again. How long have we been operating at a deficit? And do you see this as something that is going to continue into the future?
This year's our first year in the last 5 that we've operated at a deficit, and we project that will grow over time without new resource, either through the state school fund or otherwise. So this is
Okay.
this is year 1. Gets worse over time, it looks like.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
You know, when I'm looking at the, it sounds like salaries and benefits, right, and increasing staff costs have increased, but the student population has decreased. And so then I'm looking back at the SAM model. And I guess what I'm wondering is, if the student population keeps decreasing, does that SAM model then start to correct?
It adjusts. So every year we've been adjusting for that slightly. It's not perfect, right, because kids don't come in the perfect packages for those cutoff numbers, but yes, it has been adjusting as our enrollment has declined. So have some of our staff in those areas. Overall, though, we've certainly added, right? So you can kind of see that. We've added in areas, the SAM is really good at adjusting at those things like classroom teachers, those minimum counselor numbers, those kinds of things. What we've recently added more of, student success coaches, academic coaches, social workers, those are new additions in probably the last 4 years. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
I know that we took something that we, oh, sorry. Go ahead. Jasmine.
Looking at the PERS section of the numbers slide, is that expected to just keep growing at the same rate, or is there expected to be a leveling off at some point where we just maintain a certain level of reserves?
It depends. So what happens is we'll get, every year, they do a study, usually Milliman does a study for PERS on the overall fund and to say, what are we funded at? If you have good investment returns in a particular year, that could inform lower rates in future years. If you have particularly bad returns during a couple of year period, that could inform higher rates over time. So primarily, dollars come from contributions and from earnings on investments. That's where the two, and we make up one of those legs. We don't have the certainty of earnings and investment returns over time, but we certainly have that employer portion that we pay, and that's how that's determined. So this is the first year of a 2-year rate setting cycle for the next biennium. We'll get an interim one that'll kind of give us some idea, but they won't set it again till the next year. So every 2 years, we're constantly looking at that.
And I know we're at 6:55, probably want to give us a little break, but if we have any last questions, happy to take maybe one more. And then know that you can always.
Please reach out.
They'll be
We'll
sending us
send an email,
their
so,
contact
yeah.
information for you to reach out and.
Happy to speak with you. I can talk budget all day. It's a great time. Thank you.
More, okay. Thank you, Mike and Jessica and Dr. Balderas. And what, go ahead. Did you want to say something else? No, okay. So thank you. We'll now conclude the work session, and we'll begin the board business meeting at 7:00. The March 11th, 2025 Budget 101 session for the Beaverton School Board is hereby adjourned at 6:56.